Okay, moving on to item 5B, that'll be automated license plate reading technology. Ben Farrell.
This item will be presented by Assistant Chief Ben Farrell from the Police Department.
Good morning, directors. Ben Farrell, Deputy Chief with the Police Department. Here today with a informational presentation on automated license plate reader technology. So by way of background, ALPR, automated license plate reader technology, is widely used throughout the Bay Area, in fact, throughout the nation. It automatically captures license plate data with cameras, which use software to read the license plate numbers and then store that information in a database. Historically, we began looking at this ALPR technology back in 2011, and we began looking at it because we believe that it will help us deal with property crime issues that occur in our parking lots. As many of you review the logs, you know that there's auto burglaries, catalytic converter theft incidents that occur in our lots, as well as other crimes that people come and go with vehicles. So we believe the technology can help us solve some of those crimes or provide investigative leads. By 2013, we did acquire funds through Prop 1B to the amount of approximately $62,500 to acquire a set of cameras to do a test project at one location. That original location was a Rinda station parking lot, but we ran into some power problems there. And after looking at a couple other locations, I believe Coliseum and Fruitvale, we ended up at the MacArthur parking structure. And installation started last year and was completed by around November. During that time, though, and actually being signed into law in October of last year, Senate Bill 34 passed, and hence the reason for the opportunity for public comment today. It emphasizes transparency, policy, and procedure, and specifically calls for a publicly viewable policy, which eventually when this goes through, the policy will be on our website so that people can see it whenever they like. It calls for data security and reporting measures, as well as public comment before implementation. The policy, which was included in your briefing packet, was written to comply with Senate Bill 34, which we will have it posted to the policy, and it also complies with policies with NCRIC, the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, which is where the information from the ALPR devices would reside. As far as the future goes, if this test project is successful, additional fixed installations could be put at the other parking garages that would usually be based on the crime level at those locations and access points. And of course, it depends on funding too, if we could fund something like that. There is additional potential use for these devices in parking enforcement, parking fee collection, as well as lot occupancy advisements. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Before I end up going to questions from the directors, I have 3 blue slips, and I'd like to make sure that we hear from the public before the directors weigh in on their comments. Mike Katz. And Mike will be followed by Mazar or Masser.
Good morning, honorable members of the board and the public and staff. My name is Mike Katz-Lacabe. So the project to install these license plate readers at BART parking lots dates back to 2011, as you just heard. And this is the first time it's been brought to you as a board. And if not for the passage of SB 34, it's likely that license plate readers would never have come before the board and the public would remain in the dark. The item appears on the agenda not as a discussion item and action item to determine whether license plate readers should be installed, and if so, why, the implications for BART patrons' privacy, and for how long the data should be retained. Was any privacy impact assessment performed? If not, will one be performed? Will the proposed policy revisions be subject to a third-party audit? Will the results of that third-party audit be made public? What provisions are there, if any, for abuse and misuse of the system? Why was the decision made to share the data with the local fusion center? Who made that decision? Are you aware of the dozens of agencies that gain access to the collected data through the fusion center? It seems to me the BART board is not making decisions that impact its patrons. They're being left to staff. And as I recall from my position as a former elected official, the elected officials determine what, and the staff determines how. Where public input has been invited prior to implementation of license plate readers, elected officials made the decision to reduce the retention time from 1 year to 6 months. Has any case been made for retaining the data for 1 year as opposed to a shorter retention time of a few weeks or months? In the few instances in which data on license plate readers has been released, and law enforcement's done a very good job of keeping this information relatively close to its vest, it shows that 99.7 to 99.8% of the data collected by license plate readers does not generate a hit. In other words, most of the data collected is not related to anything involving suspicion of or an actual crime. As our elected officials, you need to demand transparency from law enforcement. The public won't know about these technologies unless you do your job. I would encourage you to consider implementing a surveillance equipment technology ordinance along the lines that have been implemented in Oakland, Seattle, being considered in Santa Clara County, and recently implemented in Palo Alto. They're leading the way, and you guys can too. The other thing to make clear is that all of these license plate readers have 2 cameras. One focused on gathering the license plate of the car. The other one focuses on gathering an image of the car, surrounding area, and sometimes its occupants. If you'd like to see a demonstration of that, there is a photo of me and my family getting out of my car in my driveway at my house, taken by a license plate reader. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Next, I've got JP Masar, and did I pronounce that correct? And Mr. Masar is from the Oakland Privacy Working Group.
Yes. So, the Oakland Privacy Working Group has considerable concerns about the legality of the policy and procedures being suggested, and even more about the non-transparency of how it's already been snuck through as is in operation. I believe the ACLU is also concerned about this and has or will be in contact. But I would like the board to consider a much broader question. Why do you need this at all? Why suddenly now, after 44 years of operation, does BART suddenly feel that they need to know the license plate of every single car and possibly information about individuals who park in the lot and use the system? The answer is you don't. You don't need the system. BART police want it because, as all police do, they want the latest and greatest toys. But the truth is, BART will run just fine for the next 44 years without installing this technology. The purpose of BART is to move people around the bay quickly and efficiently, not to keep a record of every car that parks in a BART lot. It's to provide service, not spying. And if I understand the testimony from previously, it should be to clean the pigeon poop, not to spy on people. The civil liberties implications of this are many. They include horror stories arising from false positive identification to information that might be used for deportations, for prosecuting people for debt, and unconstitutional investigations. But it's the general overall issue that's most important. Why does BART want to contribute to a world that Orwell imagined and into which we can't seem to be stopped being drawn? In terms of false positives, there was just an article in today's Mercury News. Menlo Park read 138,883 license plates in 3 months. 255 of them were hits, and according to the article, almost all of them were false positives. All right, here in Oakland, we took a principled stand against this sort of thing. We killed the Domain Awareness Center a spine system that would have encompassed all of Oakland. The BART board should take a similarly principled stand and simply say no. We don't want to go there. We don't want to spy on everyone. We want people to live their lives without feeling that they are always being tracked. And there's been studies released recently that show that living in such a society breeds meekness, fear, and self-censorship. I urge you to stop this project right here and now. You can do it. You have the authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mishar. Next will end up being B. Geiser.
Good morning. My name is Brian Geiser. I'm also with the Oakland Privacy Working Group, and I want to just say ditto to what the previous two speakers had said. I'm going to go into a few items sort of based around SB 34 so that I don't repeat what they've said. But before I say that, I would kind of like to, in general, say I think the BART needs to have some sort of policy on surveillance equipment in general. Because it's not just this automatic license plate reader. We have a feeling that cameras are going to be installed as we go along in the stations. We know the current trains supposedly have a lot of unworking cameras, which a lot of us actually appreciate. There's the app that you guys have. There's apparently the new trains are going to have many more cameras. Facial recognition software is incredible. Everybody can be tracked from place to place. It wouldn't be hard to have RFID readers in the station, so as people go through, they're constantly being tracked that way. We know by the cards that we use, not so much the BART ones that I get with putting cash in, but the others. Everybody's being tracked constantly. So I think we need to have a greater policy at BART about surveillance of people. Now, my remaining time, and I apologize, I have a very busy day ahead of me. I'm going to read some of the items that I wrote down here regarding SB 34. SB 34 states the existing law authorizes the Department of California Highway Patrol to have this data for not more than 60 days. Why does BART feel it has the authorization to keep it for up to a year? SB 34 states existing law authorizes the department to use LPR data for the purpose of locating vehicles or persons reasonably suspected of being involved in the commission of a public offense. That would seem to indicate the standard for authorized use is reasonable suspicion, as the term used is reasonably suspected. Number 3, SB 34 indicates the usage policy should indicate how the department will respond to a data breach should one occur. The proposed policy does not address that. And a fourth item I have down here, what is the authorization for BART's statement that they will not issue a formal policy until the technology is adopted for long-term use? SB 34 has no provision for pilot use exempting ALPR's operator from the policy usage requirement. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll end up going to comments from directors. Let's go ahead and start down here with Director Rayburn.
Thank you, Chairman McPartland. I'd like to break my questions down into two parts. One on the memorandum that you sent out, and that lists that we already have acquired a grant and installed the cameras. And I appreciate that we've been given the information that it costs $62,500 for the camera and probably a storage device and communications. What was the installation cost, and what would be an ongoing cost?
I don't know what the installation cost was. The cost for the solar and battery array that we were looking at for an alternative power supply was quite cost prohibitive, around $37,000. The actual installation, I can find that out and get back to you. There is no local storage. The information goes directly to NICRIC once it is turned on, so there is no cost involved in that.
I'll ask more about that in a minute, but the installation that you have now is at MacArthur Garage?
Yes, sir.
And that Was that activated?
No.
Okay. My other questions really follow on the whole idea of trying to safeguard the privacy of individuals and our civil rights. And I think foremost, when I look at SB 34, and it was written by Jerry Hill and signed by the governor, the thrust of that was to make certain that there would be no data breach. And I see in your policies the safeguards are lined out. But I would ask our council, if there is a data breach, my read is that we would be liable for notifying perhaps tens of thousands of people.
That's correct. If there's a data breach, there would be a responsibility on the district to notify those people of the data breach. The statute also provides that anybody harmed by a violation of the statute, if we were held to be, the standard's probably more than negligent, but have intentionally misused the service to disclose people's information, there are damages available to the people harmed.
Yeah. And so there could be some very real unexpected costs associated with deploying this technology. And so I'd like to make certain that we are defining the uses very clearly, and so that we can judge the benefits of this use versus the potential costs of deploying the system. And so I would look forward to more information about the actual uses and what other options we might have for deploying it. And I want to thank you, Deputy Chief, for sharing with me the recent ACLU policy. It's very interesting reading, and it follows on my own tracking of the issue when it was brought up in the city of Alameda. And in that city, the initial proposal was to share the information with this fusion center, which that gets really spooky, but I don't understand who would actually control the purging of the data once we've handed it over to someone else. And I'd like you to address that if you could.
I can, sir. NCRIC does the purging themselves. The standard, industry standard is a year, but as was mentioned, there are some agencies that have a shorter retention period, and they can adjust for that. The information is available to law enforcement agencies for further investigation.
And so when it's provided to these other law enforcement agencies, do they have, are they sweeping that entire database, or are they asking for a specific date and time, or how does that actually work? How could we control these data so that they're not handed out willy-nilly?
I'm not sure of all the different types of searches that can be done. I can't give you an example of how we use it, because we currently, and have been for some time, accessing the NCRIC database for license plate reader info. Even though we don't have the devices ourselves, we have access to it. And in case in point, just yesterday, a flyer came out of a warrant that had been issued for the arrest of a person wanted for assault with a deadly weapon at one of our stations. That person, during that investigation, a license plate came up, and that person is actually somewhat of a transient, lives in his car. So although he had been identified, basically the be on the lookout was for the car only. But by accessing the NCRIC database, detectives were able to identify a couple locations where that car has been seen parked. So that helps officers to kind of narrow down the area that they might be looking for the car. Now, does that keep us from, finding him at all? No, because his license is in a system anyways. Anytime an officer gets behind and decides they're going to check that car out, if you pull it over, they run the license plate, it will come up with a warrant. But by accessing that data in the NCRIC database, it provides a closer area that maybe officers can go drive around, look for the car.
Well, I'd like to make just two key suggestions, and one was from the city of Alameda's recommendation, in that they reduced the amount of time that data could be stored from 1 year to 6 months, and we've heard the speakers suggest that, without real good explanation for how the data would be used, I would even argue that maybe weeks would be an appropriate term, but the city of Alameda went to 6 months. The other suggestion is, and you've included it within the safeguards, that there would be a regular audit, and it states that it would be conducted on a regular basis. And I would want to see that we would make certain that these data are audited, and perhaps with this initial installation, should it be approved, it would need to be a pilot with a lot of scrutiny first, and that before we move on, and that scrutiny would include the full range of costs and benefits.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Director Salzman.
Thank you. I think at this point we need a lot more information, and knowing that this is one type of technology, but in the next 5-10 years, I don't think any of us have any idea what technology is going to be available. And I do think, many cities around here have adopted surveillance equipment monitoring policies to kind of get ahead of the curve, because you're going to get grant opportunities all the time, and you probably don't want to come back to the board each time to get a new policy on each type of equipment. I think it makes sense for us to be more proactive and consider a policy up front, so it's very clear what direction the board wants to go in, kind of regardless of the specific technology. So I think that's really something the board should move forward with, so we can know what's happening. I also think we should figure out as a board what information we want ahead of time. So obviously under the general manager's authority, you can go into agreements for new things, whether it's this or anything else at BART, without the board's knowledge. And so we should determine as a board what we want to know about ahead of time, and not, years after we've gotten into this. And I think it's a good point that if the legislation hadn't passed, would we even be hearing about this today? I don't know. That's something we should really be thoughtful about. Besides the policy, which I think we need, I wanted to know, if you move forward with this pilot project, how would success be measured, and how would it be determined that it would be worthwhile to move forward to apply for more funds to have more of this technology?
Well, off the top of my head, I think we would first look at how many occasions it actually provided any kind of leads. And I'm not saying necessarily leads that amount to a capture or something like that, but a lead that somebody could follow up on. For instance, a homicide that occurred last year, we were able to find a couple locations where the vehicle that was associated with the homicide had been. What we were looking for was a crime scene. We weren't successful at finding it, but that gave us some area to look. So those kind of leads, I think, would be a measure of success. The difficulty we will run into is, for instance, recently we had an arrest for catalytic converter theft. And it was the individual captured was, thanks to a very alert station agent, seen underneath a car. They called, we arrested him. He had an accomplice in a vehicle and a bunch of other catalytic converters. As luck would have it, one of those people was associated with another catalytic converter theft at another station. So what we won't have the luxury of is that kind of measurement, because we only have one station that we're checking, which is MacArthur. So I think that will be a little difficult to measure. One thing I plan on doing is reaching out to some other agencies that have similar technology. The Los Angeles Metro uses parking lot ALPR, so does Boston. So finding out, what kind of success rate they have, what they consider good leads, and also to check, see, do the cost versus the benefits weigh out?
So I think before we get into any pilot, and not just for the police, but any pilot at BART, we should upfront, before we start the pilot, have really clear measurements of what success is going to be. It sounds like you have ideas of what the measurement is, and that's good. But if we start the pilot and then in the middle of the pilot come up with measurements, I think we're biasing this pilot. And then if we get offered another grant, it's like, well, this looks like it's doing good, so let's go after this money. I really don't think we should move forward with any pilots at BART until we have just very clear measurements of what success will be and how we will determine if we'll, move forward. So that is something I'd like to see before this is started. In terms of the comments Director Rayburn brought up about a data breach, I see a little bit in here about safeguards. But it sounds like once the data, is out of our hands, and it seems like that's immediate, there's not many safeguards that BART can have. Is that correct? Because we're not managing the data.
Yeah, this might be a question IT could answer a little better, but I think most of our safeguard measures are in the transmittal process of the information. So you're correct. Once it's in their database, it's not. Now, when we mine that database and we go back and access it for information, that's another point where a data breach could occur. So, yeah, it's kind of back and forth between us and NCRIC.
That's concerning to me, and I'd like to know, more about the liabilities and how it sounds like other cities are using this database, how they're dealing with that, because it seems like we're liable for a system that we have next to no control over, and I think that's a problem. So I think we should discuss that more. So I know this isn't something we're voting on today. It's not an action item, but I would like this to come back as an action item for us to sign off on this policy, for us to sign off on what the success measurements are going to be for the pilot project. And I think slightly more long term, we really need to come up with a broader policy that considers all surveillance monitoring, so we don't have to come back each time. So it's very clear from the outset, both to the public and to the police department, about how to move forward.
Okay. George Murray?
I think that both Directors Rayburn and Saltzman expressed a lot of my views. So just getting down into the specifics on your policy, it says item C. It's used for legitimate law enforcement purposes only, criminal investigations, or department-related civil or administrative action. What is that? That seems really broad.
I'm sorry, which?
Under the last
C.
page, accountability and safeguards, item C. The data will only be used for blah, blah, blah. Criminal investigations or department-related civil or administrative action. That seems like it could be open to anything.
So it could be an internal affairs investigation related to one of our vehicles, something like that. Could also be related to a lawsuit of some kind that was somehow related to a vehicle that was coming and going in the parking lot. We could certainly firm that up. One thing to keep in mind, directors, this policy is just kind of the first run at it. We have a whole gamut of events that occur. This will go before our internal policy review committee, then it gets reviewed by the command staff, and then of course we have oversight with the Citizens Review Board, and they too would review it, and they provide a lot of suggestions when it comes to our policies, and our policies seldom look anything like the first run at them when they go through the Citizens Review Board, and they do a good job of firming things up. So that's probably one area that we need to look at, maybe to make a little more clear.
Okay, well that I think is a good process before it comes back to us, because Rebecca also mentioned about the audits. Are they going to be third party, as one of the speakers suggested?
The plan was for them to be internal audits done by ourselves. We can certainly look into third party.
Into third party. I do have sympathy with the privacy advocates, because once upon a time I tried not to give my social security number out for things. Boy, it was a choice of not giving it out or not having any services. It's almost impossible not to protect your social security number, let alone the rest of your privacy. So I have great sympathy for the topic. However, I also know the frustration that people have when their cars are stolen or burglarized or catalytic converters are stolen, and we have no way of helping them at all. So I'm kind of in favor of this idea of the license plate readers, but I do think we need more information and an overall surveillance policy.
President Julovich?
Yeah, I kind of want to join the chorus here. There's definitely a constituency for surveillance. People who want more surveillance, and we heard from them in the discussion of cameras on trains. And you know, surveillance is useful. I mean, you can catch bad guys, but there needs to be a balance here. And I think in a lot of ways, the technology just gets more and more powerful and kind of runs ahead of regulation. I was thinking a little bit about the clipper card, you know, in our old mag stripe technology. Well, nobody knows who you are. You know, you just exit, enter, very little information on the card. Clipper was a lot of information. It was tied to individuals. You know, you could create a whole dossier on who traveled where, when, all of that. And the state stepped in and regulated it. So we're now a partner in Clipper. Before we were just a kind of a subject of Clipper. But the state stepped in and regulated. Sounds like on this one too, the state sort of set a floor in terms of things that you need to do to comply, but I don't know that the floor is where we stop. So these are definitely matters of policy, and I think something that we should look at as a board. I did get thinking about the cameras on trains. You know, as one of the speakers said, they're getting better and better at you know, image recognition. You kind of actually see this on social media. You know, you see a photo and it says, "Do you want to tag your friend?" And so they're getting better and better at this. And you know, before long, you know, somebody could, if they wanted to, probably using cameras that we'll have in our stations and on our trains, track the movements of individuals through the system. And these are all things we need to think about and probably get ahead of, because again, the regulation's coming after the technology. I'd like to see us have a pretty robust policy about how they're used. Not only for law enforcement, but also for planning. I mean, I get kind of as a transportation nerd, things like license plate surveys or that data you get from Clipper, it's really intriguing because you can say, all right, we know how many people, whether it went from this station to this station, then took the bus to this station. There's this temptation to use all of that because you can plan service better. And I think there's a point at which you can say, all right, yeah, well, you can use it to a point to plan service better, but how personal should it get, right? How can you protect individuals, right, to travel if they're not under suspicion without their movements being tracked? Also, I think better ideas about who all would use this. You know, would there ever be a temptation to use this for commercial purposes? You know, if somebody says, hey, you know, we want to sell per mile auto insurance to BART, you know, we want your license plate data. Would we give it to them, or do we have a backstop that says, no, we'll never use this for a commercial purpose? Are all of these policies about privacy easily accessible? Anyone using our system can find out how their individual data is protected and what all of our policies are. I don't think that exists. There's individual things, like if you sign up for email at BART, you get privacy policy. You can at least access it, but I don't think in all of these other areas it is. So it seems like this is an area where we need some policy before we deploy these increasingly powerful technologies of surveillance.
Commissioner Blaylock?
Yes, I became aware of this technology a couple of years back and was aware that the city of Piedmont, the little city of Piedmont, was planning to employ license plate readers. It was born on the recognition they had a huge burglary rate for a fairly small city and very limited number of access points. Maybe a little bit like Alameda, only that's a bigger pond. I don't know what their success has been. I'm assuming they got the cameras installed. It might be a place to check because as Director Saltzman says, what would success look like? And in Piedmont, I'm sure it would look like, wow, we've cut burglary rates by 30% by using the license plate readers. So maybe that's one to check out if you weren't aware of it. Thank you.
All right. Normally I wait to go last, but I'm going to weigh in on a couple of issues here myself. Specifically, I definitely agree with Director Salzman from the standpoint that we need to have a global policy that will encompass everything that we do as far as surveillance is concerned. We've got station cameras, we've got parking lot cameras. We end up having law enforcement has body cameras, and I've seen as time goes on the development of individual policies that will start going in different directions. So we need to have a global encompassing policy that will end up addressing these, and I think we'll have a better policy because of it. Having said that, for clarification, we are getting or upgrading the cameras that we have within the stations and on the trains, but like to end up having it stated here, do we or do we not end up having any facial software recognition?
Not at this time that I'm aware of. I know it's something that's come up a couple times in conversations, but I do not believe that we're actively researching or looking into it right now.
Okay, that would be something that this board would definitely be weighing in on in the future. There was an interesting point that was brought up by the group from Oakland and the working group, and one of the things that we may want to end up considering, and I'm just identifying this as a quagmire that we're going to have to address, and that is if we want to end up having a policy that is in conjunction with the individual municipalities so that we don't end up being in violation of local jurisdictional territory issues. When you come up with a policy, that will be something that we'll be asking about and we'll be discussing. In addition to that, we'll want to go ahead and, go ahead and take a look at this policy from the standpoint of what are other law enforcement agencies doing? And are there any restrictions as far as the way this data is being used? Clarification from my part, I would like to end up making sure I'm pretty sure we're not going to be sharing this stuff with the Oakland Police Department, but rather we'll be depositing this data with NCRIC, and then the expectation is that the city of Oakland will not end up having the ability to go and get all of the data, but rather if they have a specific, if we identify a crime, or if the city of Oakland identifies a crime and they have a search for a specific license plate or something like that, that they'll be able to go and get that data from NCRIC. Is that the way it operates?
My understanding is the search has to be specific, so you need a license plate or a location. You could narrow it down by location, but getting a dump of the raw data, I don't believe NCRIC allows that.
All right, good, because that protects the privacy of people a lot better. Those are the main issues that I have. I want to thank the people that ended up coming up from the working group from Oakland, because I started thinking about the municipality issue. That's going to be a real bucket of worms from the standpoint of you writing a policy. If we try to address that, something that we're going to do, will we be most restrictive throughout the entire district based on the most restrictive policy, or no policy at all? Correction, we don't do it. I don't know. I'm glad that you have to write that, and I just get to weigh in on the decision. So I've basically covered the issues that I'm concerned about. So with that, I'll end up going to Director Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is what happens when security clashes with privacy. This debate is an ongoing debate and a useful, necessary debate. First, I want to start by thanking Senator Hill for the thoughtful legislation that he passed that required this kind of debate. I think back to our policy on cell phones. It was well-intentioned. We didn't have public involvement, and I think we all recall what the outcome and feedback on that was. So this is allowing us, this conversation is allowing us to avoid that type of feedback. we've been at this for a long time, and I appreciate and applaud the department for looking at ways to increase the security of and safety of our riders and our employees who are in these stations. So I think first the department should be applauded for looking for technology that would be useful in making that happen. But I think it would be important, and it was stated earlier that pilots should come before this board for consideration and have some parameters and some outcomes. I just want to remind this board that the seat removal policy has never been reviewed in public by this board. We went forward without any public conversation, and seats are being removed from our cars, and there has been some backlash, at least by people I represent, to that. But in terms of this, I just want to make a very lighthearted observation. One of the speakers said that these cameras make people timid and tend to make them less willing to speak out. My daughter lives in Manhattan, and there are cameras everywhere in Manhattan. And I assure you, the people of Manhattan are not timid or less willing to speak out. If anything, it's just the opposite. So, and that's just kind of a lighthearted observation. So what I would propose, Mr. President, I think we need to broaden the net of people who are looking at this. We've had some thoughtful comments this morning. And I don't want to delay, but I also don't want to rush. I think the more public vetting we do of this, the more likely we are to get it right. So I would propose that you consider an ad hoc committee that you would set up at the next meeting, and let's bring in the department. There were questions about IT. Let's have IT present there to answer these questions. Certainly the police department and representatives from the CRB. I appreciate the fact that the people from the Oakland Privacy Group are here today. If they had the time and were willing to participate in that conversation, I would urge you to include someone from their group, and certainly someone from the ACLU as part of the group. And if board members were interested, I might have some interest in doing that. I would be willing to participate. I spent my life in law enforcement trying to balance these two important parts of our society, privacy and security. We can do it. It just requires good conversation, good input, and the broader the net we spread in terms of getting input, the more likely we are to get a policy that works for the various interests that were here this morning and the interest that some directors talked about, the property and safety of our riders. So I don't want to rush forward, because we potentially could do another cell phone policy that gets us into more trouble than problems it solves. So if there's support for the notion of a very brief ad hoc committee, very brief, with the inclusion of the community folks who are here, and particularly ACLU. I ran a juvenile hall for a number of years in a neighboring county. And before we went into these kind of really controversial areas, I just reached out to the ACLU. And sometimes I couldn't find ways to find a common ground. Other times their suggestions were wonderful, and it made a good policy better. So I think we just need to pause, take a deep breath, widen the net of people who are looking at this, and let's try to get something that works for both interests that are legitimate, privacy and security.
Director, thank you. Well done. Director Millay?
I think most things have been said. I certainly agree that we need to balance the needs of privacy with the needs of security. I think there was reference of 99 or some percentage of the time it doesn't do anything, and that in itself I don't think is a strong argument. The real thing is protecting privacy. Certainly my home and many people's homes have cameras that most of the time, hopefully all of the time, do not result in finding someone, but are at a minimum a deterrent and helpful. So what I will take an opportunity to do is both members of the public and members of this board have reiterated the need for this board's interests to be vetted before policy is implemented. So I'm going to take the opportunity to send a signal to a particular colleague to take an initiative of theirs off of inertia and continue it forward. That initiative being BART's board and staff figuring out those administrative relations better so that this flow can be improved. My question to the Deputy Chief is, did you vet this at all with the CRB? You might have answered that already, but
We've sent the CRB the proposed policy. Additionally, we've been in contact, or I've been in contact with the ACLU. You might recall that during the body camera issue, we had some contact with them. And interestingly enough, some of the public speakers brought up the ACLU's publication, Making Smart Decisions About Surveillance. But that's a fairly recent publication, so we still have to take some time to take a look at it. But yeah, we're more than willing to include all the stakeholders.
okay. I certainly would want anything. I'd like the CRB with their specialized task of looking at these types of things to be vetted with any policy prior to it coming to this board, and both before implementation.
Yes, sir. The CRB actually vets all of our policies.
Director Josephowicz, do you have anything?
Just quickly, I didn't have much to say. I think everybody said it. I would just urge us when we're doing a kind of the more comprehensive surveillance policy, privacy policy, whatever it ends up being, that to echo what Director Radulovic says, I think we should really think deeply about how we can use this data in some type of anonymized form and some of the other data that we collect for planning purposes. I think this is like an incredibly rich trove of data which will allow us to hopefully provide much better services. Obviously, that doesn't want to come into conflict with kind of knowing where everybody's going all the time, but I don't think we need that. So I do think it's important that we address that and not dismiss it out of hand, and hopefully try and come to some sort of workable solution there. And also, if there's a way to use this data for parking enforcement, so that we can do things much more efficiently there. I know that we have some type of sort of automated license reader, handheld ones, I think, that the new parking enforcement teams use to, or not, they kind of drive around and scan. Maybe they don't. Maybe I misunderstood that. But anyway, that seems like something that a lot of parking enforcement, that a lot of people who do parking enforcement do, is they, rather than having to go and look at every single windshield and sort of check with a piece of paper whether they're. So I'd urge you to kind of consider that as well when you're developing the policy.
Thank you. In dealing with the planning department for BART to Livermore and trying to do predictions on exactly what the ridership is and where the people are going from coming down the Highway 580 corridor, I had to ask the planners, how do you come up with this data? You make this stuff up from the standpoint of people are going to San Mateo County or they're going to Oakland, and we have the data that is being read off of cell phones that are going down the freeway that identify these people, our individual riders. And so the data collection is there already. It's a function of what we're down to the splitting the hairs on, is to how much is being productive for the improvement of our society, and how much is, at what point do we end up becoming intrusive to the point where it's unacceptable. And that's what we're in the process of trying to determine, what is reasonable and what is not, and what are the desires and what is legal and what is ethical. So I agree with, and as usual, Director Keller is very thorough in his recommendation, and I would like very much to volunteer to be on that ad hoc committee. Mr. President, I would very much like to be on this ad hoc committee.
I'm a has-been. It's up to the president.
All right. Having said that, Mr. President, that concludes, this is not an action item, and that concludes the
Sir, can we just state to the public what we plan to do so they know?
I was going to try and do that right now. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of interest in, it sounds like, not just some review of this policy by the board regarding these particular cameras, but a more global policy. So Ben, with all due respect, I don't think the best idea would be to have, like, you go write one and then we look at it. I think this idea of a kind of a multi-stakeholder, a little more interactive policy makes sense. It sounds like there's certainly state law to look at, sort of sets a floor. There's what you've recommended. There is now this ACLU recommended practice, and there's municipal ordinances. So we have a lot to look at. And I think, looking at these other areas, like how planning might use this data, there is actually state law or state rules about license plate surveys. Cities are allowed to do them, but you have to anonymize them. You have to say, okay, well, we know that the person is from this zip code, not necessarily that this person is John McPartland. So there's already some protocols or in bases in law. So I think that idea of an ad hoc committee, if folks are willing, it sounds like there's at least two willing to do that. That would be great, and we'll have them work with you, and probably it sounds like IT and maybe planning, and then we need to figure out who the kind of non-BART stakeholders are that we want to involve. So we'll, I see a hand up, but one second. I think we can come back with a more definite proposal by our next board meeting of how we'll move forward with this, and then, I would just ask that you not, start using this until one, the CRB, and I think that they're a great review body for these as individual policies, and I don't want to step on their toes. They probably have more time, a little more leisure than we do to make this, and I want to see their recommendations certainly as part of this. But I think the idea of the board making policy and having that be a little more global is probably smart, and I think those two could complement each other. So we'll bring back at our next board meeting a proposal for how we'd move forward with formulating a policy that is addresses this, but that also these other concerns that various members have brought up today, and including recommendations for individuals who might want to serve on that. Does that sound reasonable?
It sounds very reasonable.
Okay.
But I just wanted to be sure I heard.
I appreciate your suggestion. Thank you.
I want to be sure I heard what you said
Mhm.
correctly, that nothing will happen further with this until we complete this process.
That is what I would recommend, that we don't start, using this until we've devised a policy.
Mr. President, the holding on the technology is something we can do.
Mhm.
We're having a hard time tracking all of the committees that are going on.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if we could use the technology committee, or what's wrong with the technology committee, because it's got at least a piece of that discussion. Is there something wrong with that choice?
There's not anything wrong with that choice. It's just, they got other stuff to do. So, but let's talk about that. You're on that. So, and
That would, I don't have any objection.
yeah, and they're 3-person committees. So if a fourth member wants to sit in on that discussion, they can do that. So that might be a fine venue. But we'll, I'm happy to use another committee if all the folks who really want to participate are able to be part of the discussion. So, but we can sort that out, if that's okay. All right. So that's what I understood. Any thoughts on that? You were making kind of like this face. So
No.
I wanted to say something.
No, we're good.
Yes, using my facial recognition technology to figure out what has Ben thinking right now. It's not very good. I'm sorry.
Question?
Yes.
Are we under any obligation from the grantor to put this, that they've paid for the system, that we're to put it into operation? Have we got any problem there?
Not to my knowledge, no, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's perfect.
All right. So I think with that, we're covered for now, but to be continued. We'll have more at our next meeting. Thank you. All right. Oh, so sorry. We're on to the planning public access. Thank you, Director McPartland. He's left us. He's done.
We hear you.
We're on to
Yeah,
Callie.
yes. Thank you. Well, the next episode